Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, baby metal, among other things, fan, and I'm here today to talk about a related idea. We now, astonishingly, have actual new music to look forward to, and it has been described as a concept album, and I wanted to have a conversation about the nature of the concept album. I had set this up before realizing that there was actually going to be a new song released. So I'm going to put this up before I get to talk about the new song, but that will be coming soon. So I've brought a guest in, Jim Fusilli, a novelist, also a rock critic for the Wall Street Journal, and we'll hear what he has to say about concept albums and about some other trends and ideas about music in general. He's a really interesting guy, and I think you'll enjoy hearing him speak. You may not always agree with it, but that's okay. So here we go. Enjoy. So my guest today is Jim Fusilli. I was trying to think when we first met, Jim. It was what? It's got to be 13, 14 years ago.
At least, yeah, sure.
Yeah. And we met originally through International Thriller Writers, because you are, of course, a novelist, author of Narrow's Gate, among other things. But
Yes.
as I discovered when I met you, you were also, I don't, for how long? You were a rock critic for the Wall Street Journal for.
Yeah, forever. I started writing for the journal in the early 80s. It was very sporadic. There was not really a commitment to having a rock critic. But as it went on, there was more opportunity. And finally, in the 21st century, I was named the paper's rock and pop critic. And I wrote a weekly column for 9 years. So, I had those two careers going concurrently.
And you also have done sort of occasional pieces for NPR and stuff like that as well, yeah?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
So this conversation comes from the fact that, as you may know, on my little YouTube channel, I talked a lot about Japanese rock band called Baby Metal, who have
Right.
a new album coming out next year, which has been described as a concept album, and this generated a lot of discussion amongst the fans as to what constitutes a concept album. And I thought, well, rather than just sort of rattle off my own ideas about this, I would talk. This is a very academic impulse. Talk to somebody who knows more about it than I do, right? So, so I just wanted to talk about that very simply. What do you think constitutes a concept album? What's the range of possibility? And maybe we can talk about some particular examples. Some well known, maybe some less so.
Yeah, I think within the pop context, it tends to be more about narrative than it does to be about musical cohesion.
Uh-huh.
I would generally consider a concept album to be a long form work that has a singular or a unified narrative theme.
A narrative theme rather than simply a tonal or musical element.
Right. I would think that if you expanded the definition of concept album to be that it had a unified musical theme, you would have thousands of them. You would have hundreds of thousands of them.
Yeah, that was my
And
feeling.
yeah, and maybe this is just coming from a writer's perspective, but I look for a cohesive narrative theme and a lyrical theme.
Now, when I was introducing you, one of the things I meant to mention was that you are, of course, author of the book on the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds album.
Correct. Yeah,
And
yeah.
I was a little surprised to see, I glanced at some lists of concept albums, and that was included. Do you consider that a concept album?
I do not, nor do I consider Sergeant Pepper to be a concept album.
I knew you were going to bring that up.
I mean, Pet Sounds has a central theme.
Mm.
That is that it's adulthood is scary, and that it's lonely, and it's disorienting. But Sloop John B certainly doesn't fit that theme.
Right.
There are two instrumentals that don't fit that theme. If you want to suggest that there's an EP within Pet Sounds that's a concept EP, that's fine.
Right.
but I would argue also that if we're going to be flexible with the definition, Pet Sounds is more of a concept album than is Sgt. Pepper. I mean, Sgt. Pepper has the framework of a concept album. We are a band known as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. We are not the Beatles. And here's our first song sung by Billy Shears.
Mm-hmm.
That concept is discarded immediately. They adhere to the concept for less than 5 minutes. And they don't return to the concept until the 11th track, which is a reprise of the first track.
Yeah.
And then the album ends with A Day in the Life, which is clearly not sung by Billy Shears.
Right. So I was thinking about Sgt. Pepper and trying to think. I mean, as you say, to think of it as a concept album outside the bookends of those of the intro and outro, as it were, would require such a flexible definition, so broad that, as you say, it would include then, is Revolver a concept album in the same terms? I mean, it starts to get pretty vague.
Yeah, I mean, the concept, Revolver would be a concept album like Pet Sounds is a concept album.
Right.
There is an overarching narrative theme, but it's so general. I mean, what's the narrative theme of Revolver? We are adults entering a strange new world. That's so general. It's not specific. It's not if you wrote a novel with that as the theme, it would be 10,000 pages long, and it would reach no conclusions.
Right. Yeah. And when it's interesting the reference to the idea of a concept EP within an album, because I was thinking about, and the first things that came to mind were things like Rush 2112 or Hemispheres, those kind of, because I often think of concept albums as having a sort of progressive rock kind of, I mean, I know they're not all like that, but often those were the first ones that came to mind. And then I thought, but actually, of course, 2112 is really just one side of the album. The rest are completely separate. Same with Hemispheres. And it made me think, well, maybe there's something about that kind of concept which presupposes a sort of vinyl format in which you listen to the entire thing in at least as a side, and then you're into something else.
Yeah, I think prog rock being big and anthematic and pompous, suits well big statements, lyrical statements. When I think of Yes's Tales of Topographic Oceans, for example, I mean, what is that really? I mean, it works, but this is sort of concept albums don't have to be big things,
right?
If we go back to what are considered the first pop concept albums, the Sinatra albums of the 40s with the sort of loneliness and alienation as a theme. These are quiet, direct, accessible statements that also produced several hits, but taken together, they're consumable experiences. And if you go into the sort of country music concept albums of the late 50s, early 60s by Johnny Cash or Marty Robbins, again, they're not big albums. In fact, those are quite intimate, those albums, and you cozy up to them, and you don't need any preconceived education to consume what the messaging is. The messaging is quite human. So the idea that a concept album has to be a big thing, the equivalent of opera, I've never bought into that.
Yeah. Okay. And again, I was thinking, even like one of the first things I thought of, which always gets referenced as a concept album, is something like either Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon or King Crimson, Court of the Crimson King. But again, is that really a concept album? Does something like 21st Century Schizoid Man fit that sort of ethereal fantasy world kind of stuff that is going on in the other songs on the album? I don't think so.
No, what I would say to anybody who is struggling to define a concept album is just say, what is the theme? What is the unifying theme? Dark Side of the Moon for me is about impending mental illness or the arrival of mental illness and how to cope with mental illness, which became Roger Waters' great theme. One could say that it's the observation of Syd Barrett that caused him to have this theme, or his own personal experiences. But nonetheless, when you listen to Dark Side of the Moon, you can pretty much figure out what it's about.
Mm.
I think King Crimson albums are more unified by sound, by the approach to
Style.
rock.
Yeah.
So the more we adhere to a single definition, the easier it is to find works that fit it.
Right.
I don't think you can reverse engineer it. I don't think you can have 10 albums and then decide what a concept album is. I think it's better to decide beforehand and then start putting things into it.
Yeah. I was wondering, do you think Skylarking, the XTC album, is that a concept album?
I don't know it other than as, well, maybe this is the answer. I know it as an individual collection of songs.
Right.
I've never considered it to be, boy, this is a confession. I don't know that I've ever listened to it in order.
Really?
Which I think is one thing about concept albums is that first of all, they require a commitment to the album as a delivery system. And secondly, you must listen in order, because where is this narrative theme going? Is there going to be a conclusion? In the Sinatra albums, there's not a conclusion. It's not, the last song on the albums are not, well, anyway, now that we've fleshed this out, I'm happy again. There's no conclusion, but yeah, I mean, I have to confess that there are a lot of albums that other people might say have a concept, but I don't see it, because I've never listened to it in that manner.
And I wonder if this is part of the conversation that some of the fans are having now. It's because they're not used to thinking of albums as albums. They're used to thinking them as individual tracks that show up on playlists, or they're streaming on Spotify or whatever. And that the idea of the album as album is itself a retro kind of concept,
Yeah, you could argue that between, well, the beginning of the MTV era until maybe, the early 21st century, there were very few, if any, concept albums, because in the industry, it was perceived wisdom that no one listened to albums, that people just wanted tracks. And I remember talking to Mick Jagger or Nick Cave about these things. And I would say to them, why do you go through the trouble of sequencing your albums when nobody listens to them in order? And their argument was, well, I do. And this is how I want my music to be presented. But they were both fully aware that people were just going to go and get their favorite tracks. But you do see
Is there a Stones album that gets close to a concept?
Not in terms of lyrical themes, I wouldn't think. But, they've changed their sound. Well, maybe, look, it's still Keith and Charlie and everything built on top of that.
Right.
But I don't think they ever pursued a cohesive narrative. But I think that black music has done a lot to revive the idea of a concept album, but also is overlooked as essential to having made great concept albums. I think one of the greatest concept albums, if not the greatest concept album, is What's Going On by Marvin Gaye. This has a unified narrative theme. A Vietnam veteran returns to America, looks at his country, and is disappointed by what he sees. This goes through every track, this theme. The narrator is the same for every track. It's also musically cohesive also, but this album is in my mind, in every way fits the term concept album.
That's interesting. And that's another one of those examples that I only know it as individual tracks. I don't think I've ever listened to the whole thing.
Yeah. I would say that when we enter the 21st century, people will often cite American Idiot by Green Day as the
Mm.
return of the concept album. And it is, I mean, it's intentionally a concept album. But, I think Black musicians have made albums with cohesive themes. I'm thinking about The Arch Android by Janelle Monáe or Legacy by Jamila Woods. These are concept albums. And I'd also argue that Kendrick Lamar's body of work is exploring a single concept, which is, who am I? How did I become this person? What is my responsibility? To whom am I responsible? Where does my faith fit in? How do I put my faith in action? You have here a narrator who is struggling with his place in life.
Mm.
And it's pretty raw stuff at times. I'm a celebrity. I'm a father. I've got to get out of here. But if I get out of here, who am I? Because in fact, I am this thing that I'm trying to flee. This is a concept.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with Young the Giant, the sort of alt pop rock band. They've just produced a new album, which is interestingly the first one that they have done since departing from their major label, and it's called American Bollywood. And I haven't sat down and listened to the whole thing entirely, but it feels like a concept album, which sort of is entirely about wrestling with their own sort of cultural origins, their Indian heritage and things like that, which seems to be present throughout the album.
Yeah, I haven't heard it, but I'm very glad to hear you say that, because when I first came upon that band, I thought one of the most interesting aspects was the new colors they were bringing to what was, rock at the time.
Yeah.
And they got away from that.
Yeah, I thought so too.
So if that's the case, I can't wait to hear it.
Yeah. For what I've heard is good. I think it's worth checking out. Yeah.
Great.
So, and what you're saying about Kendrick Lamar, I wonder if that applies to something like Baby Metal as well, in the sort of the oddity of what they are, in this sort of strange, sort of unique formulation and an exploration of where they fit into the larger music industry. But I'll have to think about that some more. So what else should we be listening to in terms of concept albums, or that you would recommend?
Well, I would say that once we agree on a definition, and everybody has, I'm not saying that this definition is the only definition, but you can't shoehorn an album into the definition. For example, there are people who argue that Black Messiah by D'Angelo is a concept album. It's all over. It's not a single concept, other than, I'm a Black musician and I make Black music. There are, from Stevie Wonder's classical period, that 5-album stretch, there are social messaging songs, and then there are traditional love songs that lounge singers would cover. So, I'm guilty of hopping around from track to track, as everyone is. So, after Jamila Woods's Legacy, which was 2019, I think, I can't think off the top of my head of another concept album.
That's interesting.
But I wish I could remember who it was. It might have been, it might have been somebody like Nick Lowe or Mark Knopfler, just, as an aside, saying, well, if I did that, it would be a concept album. And it made it sound like it was the worst thing that anybody could ever do. But this as a novelist, when we are working at the highest level, even in the most commercial field, we're really writing about ourselves and what we're trying to learn about ourselves. Well, isn't that what happens in high-end pop music? And therefore, that, if an artist said to you, yeah, well, this album is about me trying to figure out who I am, you might have to agree that was the concept. but I think that's a pretty loose application.
Right. Because then we're using the term concept to simply mean a moment in their career, right?
Correct.
It's like,
Right.
here's where I am in terms of sound. And I actually spoke to Young the Giant about this on their like 2 tours ago. And when the new album came out, I think it was uh, Home of the Strange, I guess. And I said, as you're forming the album, do you come up with a sort of larger idea, or is it on songs emerge and then they get compiled? And they said, in that case, the latter. Individual songs get written and then they get sort of put together into the album.
Interesting.
Um,
You know,
and,
I know Laura Marling a little bit. I was an early champion of her work, and I spent some time with her, and she would make jokes. I would ask her personal questions, and she would say, "I'm British. I'm not going to answer that question." She would, deftly step out of, not wanting. But I think that's someone who writes about what they are going through at that moment. And I think once was Eagles or something. So I think that's the time. Let me just see if I can find this very quickly. Um, you know, I think her work is highly personal and would then fit in the concept of being a concept album. Come on, Jim, find this thing. Yeah, Once I Was an Eagle is the album. I love this album, and she would just not admit that it was about a breakup of a relationship and recovery from a relationship, but it clearly was. It clearly was. If we accept that as a definition, I'm a writer. I write what I'm going through at the time, and then I present it to the public. Um, then what? Every Joni Mitchell album is a concept album.
right, right.
Um,
If
if you
that's our
look,
standard of coherence and unity,
right.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think it has to be. I, um, I would say that it can't be applied after the fact. If an artist says, "Oh, I have these 12 songs," and lo and behold, they seem to be about the same thing, I'm not quite sure that that's the same as sitting down and saying, "I'm going to write an album about my father's death," or something like that.
Right, right, right. Now, what does that remind me of? There's a Sting album that does that, sort of, right?
Right.
Which one is it? Is it 10 Summit? No. I forget, but I'm not suggesting it's a concept album, but I think that the death of his father looms over several songs, and is, but I don't think it affects the whole album. And I
You
can't
know,
remember.
I know Dennis Lehane a bit,
Oh yeah.
and Dennis, we shared an agent for a while, and Dennis wrote a novel that I cannot think of the name of it now. Oh, yes, I can. Shutter Island, which in theory is a horror story. Uh,
Right, it
it's
was made
about
into a movie or
a
a TV
film.
series.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I'm telling a story out of school. Maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. But uh, he admitted to someone, "I don't really know what this book is about."
Huh.
And the person he was talking to said to him, "It's about your divorce." And apparently that was the case. That this was a way for him to examine this experience.
Mm, mm,
And we see this all the time. We sit down to write a novel, and when it's finished, we say, "Oh, I didn't really realize I was going to explore that."
mm.
I don't think it's very fair then to say, "Well, this is an album. This is a book about X." If
Yeah,
you didn't
yeah,
know it was going to be a book about X,
yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's quite different than sitting down saying, "I'm going to write a book about X."
Do you still listen to albums as albums?
I do. Since I left the journal in 2018, though, I've been undergoing a phenomenon that I only realized recently, that in all those years I was listening to nothing but new music.
Mm.
And when I say new music, I don't mean music that just came out. I mean music that was coming out in 4 months or something like that. And I was going to shows all the time, and there was no time to listen to anything else. other than to get a frame of reference, to just double check to make sure that, this was part of a continuum of an artist. But I have been listening a lot to old music because now I have the time to do it.
Mm.
And, you know, very rarely will I listen to an entire album, but I will listen to most of an album. I just think we know where the dead spots are.
Yes.
And we don't want to suffer them.
Mm.
But in preparation for this, I listened to Pimp a Butterfly again, which I just think is a massive work. I think it's so incomprehensible in its vastness, and yet it's so specific to a human experience. I mean, it's just great, and that I don't think you can separate into individual tracks. You have to enter and surrender, and there you'll be for the next 45 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
It would go back to Dark Side of the Moon. I never want to hear Money again. It doesn't make any. I don't know why it's on that album. I don't know how it fits on that album.
Mm.
You might as well put like the Archies or the Monkees in the middle of one track of that album. It just destroys the flow for me. So why would I suffer it?
Yeah. So since I have you here, one of the things that people are frequently talking about is the future of music, both in terms of how things get recorded, how they get disseminated, what are the trends within music, what's thriving, what's dying. I always love to see the things that you post on social media and such. And I was wondering if after all these years that you've had, not just thinking about music, but talking to musicians, interviewing people, what are the big movements that you see happening at the moment? Where are we going? What are we leaving behind? And how is the industry evolving, do you think?
Yeah, I think by my nature, I'm a glasses full person. I always look for what's good now. The second thing is I don't believe in generational bias. If people tell me, if even there's the slightest hint in their comment that what they're talking about is the result of generational bias, I kind of click it off. Things are as
People
good
say
now.
Nothing good has been written since 1975.
Right, like that, yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I wrote this piece for the Journal many, many years ago, and it still turns up, in which I define those people as GBs, the generationally biased. And I said things in it that were not particularly controversial. That Bjork's Vespertine is better than Sgt. Pepper. That Los Lobos Kiko is better than whatever, and that Rolling Stones top 500 album lists are stupid. And it got such outrageous response by people my age, that they just could not believe that anybody could say that Sgt. Pepper isn't the greatest album of all time. It's not even the best Beatles album. How is it the greatest album of all time? It's not. And if you said to me, name the 100 greatest albums in rock history, I wouldn't start in 1965. I'd start in 2022, and I'd work backwards.
Wow.
Because we have great music right now, and it is in equal proportion to what it's always been. A lot bad, a lot good, mostly in the middle, and an occasional album that will last for decades.
That's
now,
really
in terms of where we're going, I do think we're in a little bit of a lull. I think that it is time for a new movement. It's time for a new Elvis, or it's time for somebody to just blow it up.
Do you think that's possible anymore? Do you think that as a culture we are so sort of fragmented and niche focused because of the way we consume information and the way everything is sort of packaged for small populations. Do you think there will ever be another Elvis or Beatles or somebody who dominates, or even a Michael Jackson, or somebody who's so dominant that everybody is listening to them?
I have to say yes, based on my view of things. I mean, um, you know, I like her. She's a sweet kid, but I don't listen to Taylor Swift, and yet she's just omnipresent.
Mm.
You know, I don't listen to Lady Gaga, and she's, you know, omnipresent. They have somehow crashed into everyday life. You know, I remember when EDM was first becoming popular. I was a very early adopter of EDM as far as a mainstream critic was concerned. I just thought this was really a great musical movement, that it was based on a lot of components that connected to, you know, great instrumental music of the past. And that went sour really fast. You know, it became formulaic so quickly and became a part of the zeitgeist. You couldn't avoid bad EDM any more than you could have avoided bad disco 25 years earlier. But I have to believe that there's somebody at the cusp of making a new statement that is generated from what we had in the past, but just delivers it to us in an entirely new and accessible way.
Mm.
Because otherwise, what, you know, we would, you know, we what would we look forward to? You know, it's, you know, it's you know, if it's like film, it's like architecture, it's like dance. You know, um, we readily accept great new directors.
Mm.
You know, we readily accept great new novelists, for example. We're not so eager to accept great new popular music.
It's something about, I mean, the way that the number of people I know of my age or older, actually, or younger, who seem to not have listened to anything new in 10, 20 years, that their standards of excellence are still locked into their own adolescence
Yes.
or the years
Yeah.
shortly thereafter.
Yeah. Um, and I think I tried to be forgiving of the audience because people have been brainwashed into thinking this way.
Hmm.
You know, and you know, if you look at the cultural gatekeepers in rock and pop, they've been telling us for decades that the 60s and the early 70s were the golden age of popular music. This is demonstrably false. You know, you know, there's, you know, there's some great albums there, but there's some horrible albums there. You know, if people say to you, okay, where are the Beatles of today? The answer is, well, where were the Beatles of the 60s, 70s, and 80s? There was one Beatles. Don't make it sound like there were 100 Beatles. You know,
Hmm.
there was one Beatles.
Yeah.
So, you know, you know, I mean, it wasn't like, you know, Duke Ellington's playing over there and Count Basie's playing over there and Benny Goodman's playing over there and Glenn Miller's, you know, Fletcher Henderson's over there. It wasn't like that, you know? And I've actually had this argument with Elton John, you know, who is just the first of all, he's a lovely, lovely man. And he will talk about music until your ears fall off. He's just everything you want Elton John to be, he is. But he will tell you, oh, I used to buy 10 great albums a week. And I would say, well, no, you didn't. You didn't. You didn't. Because we didn't have 10 great albums a week, you know? I
I,
mean,
I
you know,
love
let's,
the image. I just love the image of you contradicting Elton John about me.
I have to say it was on the phone because maybe if, you know, he was looking at me, I might be more timid. But, you know, this idea that, you know, and, you know, when I was in college, you know, I was a DJ on the radio station and I was the rock critic of the college newspaper. And you know, I had a job that afforded me the opportunity to buy concert tickets and album. So I'm exactly the kind of guy that would say from 1971 through 1975 was the golden age of rock and pop
Mm-mm.
because I was completely steeped in it.
Yep.
Um, but it's not,
Mm.
you know, it's not. I mean, you know, look at 1959, you know, when you and your viewers have an opportunity, look at the albums that came out in 1959. they are absolutely astonishing. You know, you could go into the mid teens, 2014, 15, 16, and find great albums that many people my age have no idea.
What are
You
you
know,
thinking of from '59?
oh gosh, yeah, I mean Ray Charles, Ornette Coleman, Miles, Coltrane,
Mhm.
uh, even in popular music and country music, the Louvin brothers. Just these are albums that broke barriers.
Mhm.
Just seemed to me the entire year consisted of breaking barriers, doing new things. I think Ella Fitzgerald sings Cole Porter came out that year. I could be
Mhm.
wrong, but it was one of the Gershwins maybe, but something like that. The entire year seemed dedicated to blowing up what came before it. And to me, that's one of the things. I mean, I mean, it's just it's incomprehensible, really, that people who claim to love music don't listen to new music.
Mhm.
Then what is it about music you love then?
Mhm.
I remember um, this was my favorite song with my first love. Okay, but that could be a bad song. You know, I mean, what makes it a good song
Right.
beyond you like it? One of my favorite albums is in the States, it's known as Mink DeVille. It actually has a name, but it's an orange cover. It's a Mink DeVille album. I love this album. This album I would take to a desert island
Mhm.
above most others. But it's poorly recorded. The instruments are substandard. His personality is so strong and so distinctive and the songs are great. They're well constructed songs.
Mhm.
But I could not defend this album critically as being comparable to Kid A or something like that,
Right.
or again to Pimp a Butterfly. I just like it a lot.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
when I put it on, I am transported to Greenwich Village in the 80s, and you know it's a soundtrack to my that period of my life. But it
So,
doesn't mean it's good.
okay, so let's home in on that for a second, because of course I will get pushback on the distinct on because some people will always say, oh well, quality, it's always subjective. You're not saying that. You're saying there's a difference between things I like and things that I think are good. So
Correct.
how do you define what you think is good, objectively, measurably, qualitatively good?
Yeah. As a critic, and I'm no longer a critic. I mean, since 2018, I've done exactly one album review as a favor to the manager of the band, who pointed out to me that every other critic misunderstood the album. Um, I had to have objective standards by which to measure the music.
Okay.
These standards were singular to me. No one else had to agree with them.
Mhm.
I looked for a demonstration of craft first and foremost, which is something most people don't do. To me, the player had to play, the singer had to sing, the writer had to write, the arranger had to arrange. This had to be craft based. It had to be art rising from craft, right? People don't really care about that. They don't know that that's really not the drummer. That's a drum machine for 14 bars, or that guitar player really can't play, so they invited some other guy to come in and play it. Or though, take a Beatles track, they're almost from 65 on, they're almost all cobbled together from several takes.
Mhm.
The consumer doesn't care about that. They, you know, the second thing I looked for was an attempt to be original. You didn't have to quite get there, but you had to be trying to do it.
Mm.
And we would cut some slack. I would cut some slack for new bands because it's impossible for new band to sound like anything other than their predecessors.
Mm.
Because how do they learn to play? They learn to play by imitation.
Mm.
You know,
Mm.
you have to have some chops before you can start making your own statements.
Mm.
And then the third thing, which was entirely subjective within this objective analysis, was I had to be moved. You know, and it didn't matter if it was, it made me feel silly, or it made me feel inspired, or it made me laugh, or it made me sad. I just needed to have the human connection to the artist. That would be my definition of what's good.
Mm. Interesting.
And if everyone develops their own definition based, no, those are general terms, by the way. Nowhere in those definitions are any musical terms. You don't have to know music to apply those standards. You don't have to be a musician. You just have to be able to, have some sort of definition. And people say all the time, well, it's entirely subjective. It's not entirely subjective. We know that certain bands are better than other bands. We know it. You know, and if somebody came up and said, "Oh, Mozart is crap," well, how do you say that? Why do you say that? We would compel that person to defend the opinion on the basis of objective standards. We have a hierarchy in the great musical artists of history. This is not subjective, really. I suppose like the Beatles Stones argument. There's a lot of subjectivity there.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember in high school saying, it wasn't even high school, it was elementary school. This song, Good Vibrations, this is better than anything the Stones ever released. And everybody wanted to just pummel me. How could you? The Beach Boys are so square, and the Stones are what's happening. Well, who won that fight? 50 years later, I'd like to point out. But at some point, it has to work as music.
Right.
It just cannot be cacophony. Again, in preparation for this conversation, I listened to "Freak Out" by Zappa and the Mothers, which many people claim is the first rock concept album. The concept is so loose. The concept is America's a weird place, isn't it? But I was listening to it thinking, oh God, these guys can hardly play. And so I did some research, and in fact, Zappa says, compared to our peers, we were miles ahead of them. But in terms of music in general, we're rubbish. And I think that's another kind of analysis.
Yeah.
If you listen to Radiohead's music, this is superior music on every level. Of all of the, at least certainly to my standards, they can play, they can write, they can arrange, they can sing, they're adventurous. They are original. The body of work shows growth and an occasional retreat in order to grow in a different direction. And when I listen to Radiohead, I'm moved all the time.
Yeah. So then you're not going to be a fan of early punk where people are bashing out a few chords on instruments they can barely play and things like that.
No. And in fact, where I was doing a lot of my hanging out in that era, I almost never went to CBGBs. Because I didn't get it. Occasionally people would say, "Oh, you need to come by and see, Talking Heads, and or television." And I would be like, well, I hate that room. It smells, and the 5 opening acts will be people who don't know what they're doing, and it's really awful. I'll just go to the bottom line, which is less than half a mile away, and here's some music I can comprehend. Okay, the folk rock movement at that period was pretty abysmal anyway, but it was, you could identify music, the guy could play, the gal could play. She could write a tune.
Mm-hmm.
It fit in some continuum. I'm not interested in social movements whatsoever in terms of music. If I look at Guernica, I think, oh, that's really great. What a painting.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make me want to, sign up and fight the fascists.
Right.
I take the work as a work of art, not a work of social commentary.
Interesting.
Because this is part of just being raised within the Wall Street Journal system. If you went to the cafeteria and you started talking about something, guaranteed there was somebody within 50 feet who was an absolute expert on that subject. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what does the rock critic know about that? And they would be right.
Yeah.
Let me talk about the ripple effect of Watergate.
Mm.
Well, Bob over there was the attorney for 7 people who were, prosecuted for Watergate. Maybe we should ask him. Or, boy, I saw a picture of the Taj Mahal. Oh, I was married at the Taj Mahal. Somebody would say. It was.
Yeah.
So stay within your lane is a pretty good piece of advice.
Yeah. This is not something I'm very good at.
No, neither am I. I mean, actually, somebody was excoriating me last night on Facebook about, I had an opinion, and he said, you're an expert on a lot of things, aren't you? Very sarcastically.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I said, no, I know like very few things, but I know them really well.
Mm.
And also, I'm a writer, so I know how to convince you that I know them. But if you think about it, I really don't know very much. I just know a lot about a little.
Mm. Mm. Well, this has been great. I don't want to monopolize a lot of your time. I've already kept you longer than I said I would. So, but I'm sure my viewers will be really appreciative and interested in everything that you've had to say. Is there anything you would like to leave us with? It doesn't have to be a concept album. Stuff that we should be listening to. So music that you're excited about right now that you would recommend people check out.
Well, I think that, and this is not a particularly original statement, but I think female singer-songwriters are absolutely dominating rock and pop here in the States. Small artists making small albums. Wise Blood is a perfect example. Soccer Mommy, another example. You could just go on and on with this, but these are completely competent musicians who write great tunes. Phoebe Bridgers, I mean, once you dip a toe in there, you'll be in there for years, and it's not just America, I mean, Aldous Harding, I love, and I mean, it's just a great period for singer-songwriters, and they're overwhelmingly women. I would add that I realize I've offended a lot of your viewers with my opinions. So I have a website, it's just www.jimfusilli.com, and they could come and tell me what an idiot I am. Just be careful, because the webmaster's a nice young lady.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jim. I really appreciate it.
We'll see you later.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's it. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe, check out my Patreon page, or buy a book. And I will be back again soon to talk about the new Baby Metal song, among other things. All right. Till then.